Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. I've always known that I wasn't cut out for a life where strangers dictate how I live, where each fence is the same color and a fine arrives for a trash can that was put up 5 minutes earlier. I chose freedom, a land where no one tells you what to do. But as soon as I relaxed, the first letter arrived. I always knew I wasn't meant for the kind of life where people told me how to live it. Some people thrive under structure, rules, and tidy little neighborhoods where everyone pretends to be polite but keeps a running tally of their neighbors' every mistake. I, however, suffocated in it. Growing up in the suburbs of Atlanta, I lived under the iron grip of a homeowners association. It wasn't just about keeping the neighborhood nice, it was about control. They fined people for things that had no impact on anyone, like leaving a trash bin out 5 minutes too early or parking a truck in your own driveway instead of the garage. One neighbor got written up because his mailbox was the wrong shade of beige. Another had to fight for 6 months just to install a fence because the HOA didn't like the way it disrupted the community aesthetic. I learned early that HOAs weren't about community. They were glorified middle managers who got off on power. As a kid, I had my first run-in with them when I left my bike on our front porch instead of putting it in the garage. A letter arrived in the mail the next day. Unapproved exterior clutter. Fine. $50. My parents paid it and told me to just follow the rules. I hated it. In high school, it got worse. I borrowed my dad's truck and parked it on the street overnight because I had an early shift at work. Another fine. I shoveled snow off our sidewalk but didn't use HOA-approved de-icing salt. Another fine. It didn't matter if it was harmless. It didn't matter if no one was actually bothered by it. It only mattered that someone in the HOA got to play enforcer. I remember sitting in my room at 17, staring out at the perfectly identical houses lined up in neat little rows, thinking, this isn't a neighborhood. This is a prison with landscaping. I made a promise to myself that night. I'd get out. I'd never let anyone tell me how to live on my own land. But promises are easy. Escape takes time. Like everyone else, I went to college, got a business degree, and landed an office job that paid well enough to afford a tiny, overpriced apartment in the city. It was better than the suburbs, but it still felt like I was living in a box, surrounded by other people in their own boxes, stacked on top of each other like a human filing cabinet. The noise, the congestion, the never-ending pressure to work, earn, consume, and repeat, it drained me. The only thing that kept me sane was a dream. When I was a kid, my grandfather had a small farm out in rural Maine. It wasn't big or fancy, just a stretch of land with an old house, a barn, and acres of open fields that seemed to go on forever. I spent summers there, running barefoot through the grass, helping mend fences, and watching my grandfather work with his animals. He had cows, a couple of dogs, and a stubborn old mule that never listened to anyone. It was there that I learned what peace actually felt like. At night, the sky wasn't blocked by streetlights or neon signs. I could see every star. During the day, the air smelled of fresh hay, pine, and damp earth. It was real. It was alive. It was everything the suburbs weren't. I never forgot that feeling. So while my coworkers spent their paychecks on expensive dinners and vacations, I saved every dollar. Every bonus, every tax refund, every bit of extra cash went into a fund labeled the escape plan. Most people thought I was joking when I said I was going to buy land. What are you going to do out there? Talk to cows? They'd laugh. Man, you'll get bored in a week. You? A farm? Yeah, right. They didn't get it. I didn't just want space. I needed it. And then, one day, after years of searching, I found it. The listing didn't look like much at first. The photos were grainy, probably taken on an old phone. The house was weathered, its once white paint faded into a dull gray. The barn had seen better days. The fencing looked half collapsed in some places, and the land was wild, untamed, nothing like the sterile green carpets of suburbia. But as I clicked through the pictures, something clicked inside me. This wasn't some polished suburban home built last year to look rustic. This place had history. The bones were solid. The land stretched out for 40 acres. And the best part? It was far away from everything. No neighbors watching from their perfectly manicured lawns. No HOA dictating the color of my house. No rules, no fines, no restrictions. Just land. Mine. I didn't hesitate. A week later, I flew out to Maine and drove straight to the property. When I stepped out of the car, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the empty, dead kind of silence that comes when the power goes out in a city, but the good kind. The kind where you can hear the wind rustling through the trees, birds calling in the distance, the faint creak of an old wooden barn settling into itself. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I walked up the gravel driveway, boots crunching against the stones. The house was old, but sturdy. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up to the door. The previous owner, an old man named Walter, greeted me with a firm handshake. We didn't need a long conversation. He saw the way I looked at the place. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" he said, leaning against the porch railing. "More than you know." 2 months later, the property was mine. The first morning in my new home felt unreal. I woke up before sunrise, threw on my boots, and stepped outside with a hot mug of coffee. Fog rolled over the fields, thick and heavy, swirling around the fence posts like something out of a dream. I had never felt this free. No honking horns, no HOA notices in the mailbox, no damn city noise buzzing in the background. I was alone, and I loved it. I spent the first few weeks getting the place in order. The old farmhouse needed some work. The roof had a few leaks. The floors creaked like a haunted house, and some of the windows rattled in the wind, but nothing I couldn't handle. I repainted the house in a deep, dark blue, a color that meant something to me. Not some HOA-approved beige. My color. I fixed up the barn, reinforced the fencing, and set up a small vegetable garden behind the house. Then came the animals. I didn't want a full-blown farm, but I wanted something real, something alive around me. I got 3 cows, big, lumbering creatures with soft brown eyes who followed me around like oversized dogs. And, speaking of dogs, I adopted 2, Jasper and Rocky. Jasper was a mutt with shaggy black fur and a heart of gold, and Rocky was a lean, muscular shepherd mix who took his job of protecting the land a little too seriously. They were my family now. At night, I sat on my porch, listening to the wind rustling through the trees, the distant sound of the cows shifting in the barn, the occasional bark from Jasper or Rocky as they patrolled the land. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was trapped. I had done it. I had escaped. I had won. Or so I thought. It started with an envelope, a plain, official-looking letter sitting in my mailbox one morning, sealed in an envelope with bold red letters at the top. Notice of violation, immediate action required. I frowned. Who the hell was sending me violations? There was no one out here to violate anything. I wasn't bothering anyone. The nearest neighbor was half a mile down the road. I tore it open and scanned the contents. Dear Mr. Whitaker, your property is in violation of the Stone Hollow Homeowners Association regulations. The following infractions must be corrected within 14 days. Unauthorized exterior paint color. Homes must conform to HOA. Approved neutral tones. Unapproved livestock. Farm animals are restricted in our residential zones. Disruptive noise complaints. Excessive barking from dogs. Improper fencing. Barn must not be visible from the road. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $250, increasing daily until corrections are made. Non-compliance may lead to legal action and potential property lines. I had to read it twice. HOA. What HOA? This wasn't a gated community. I hadn't signed up for any association. My deed was clear. I owned this land free and independent. I glanced around, half expecting someone to pop out of the trees with a clipboard, waiting to slap another fine on me for standing outside without permission. My first instinct was to laugh. Then I got angry. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number at the bottom of the letter. The phone rang once before a clipped professional voice answered. This is the Stone Hollow Homeowners Association. How may I direct your call? I didn't waste time. Yeah, I just got some kind of violation notice in the mail. There's a mistake. I'm not part of your HOA. There was a pause. Then a new voice came on, colder, sharper, full of fake authority. This is Sally Flynn, president of the HOA. May I have your address? I gave it to her. Ah, yes, Mr. Whitaker, she said smoothly. You are, in fact, within our jurisdiction. The community guidelines apply to your property. I gritted my teeth. That's interesting, because my property deed says otherwise. Another pause. Then a condescending sigh. I understand your confusion, The Stone Hollow HOA was expanded 5 years ago to encompass additional properties for uniformity and community values. Your land is included in that expansion. I clenched my fist around the phone. I never signed anything agreeing to be part of this. You can't just decide I'm in your HOA. Her voice turned icy. These regulations are non-negotiable, Mr. Whitaker. You are expected to comply. Then she hung up. I hoped it was a mistake, some bureaucratic mix-up that would go away if I ignored it. It didn't. A week later, a second letter arrived. Notice of escalated fines. Urgent action required. Your fines have increased to $500 due to failure to address violations. Continued non-compliance may result in property liens and legal action. I gritted my teeth. Fine. They wanted a fight. They'd get one. That night, I dragged an 8-foot wooden board to the entrance of my property and painted in bold black letters, "This property is not part of the HOA. Stop sending false violations. Trespassers will be prosecuted." I hammered it into the ground, right where no one could miss it. The next morning, I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee and watched a black SUV pull up to my fence. A woman stepped out, Sally Flynn. She was in her late 50s, dressed in a pressed blazer and heels that were entirely impractical for stepping onto a farm. Her eyes locked onto me with the thinly veiled disgust of someone who thought I was lower than her. She crossed her arms. "Mr. Whitaker, this is completely unacceptable." I leaned casually against the fence. "Morning to you too, Sally." She scowled at the sign. "You need to take that down immediately." I took a sip of my coffee. "No." Her mouth twitched. "Excuse me?" "No," I repeated. "I'm not in your HOA. I don't have to follow your rules." Her expression hardened. "If you refuse to comply, we will escalate this matter legally." I let out a slow breath. Then I reached into my pocket, pulled out the latest violation notice she had sent me, and without breaking eye contact, ripped it in half. Her lips tightened into a thin line. "You'll regret this, Mr. Whitaker." I smiled. "I sincerely doubt that." She turned sharply on her heel, stomped back to her SUV, and drove off, kicking up gravel as she sped down the road. I should have felt satisfied. I had stood my ground. But as I watched the SUV disappear, a strange feeling settled in my gut. This wasn't over, not even close. I should have known Sally Flynn wouldn't take no for an answer. The way she had looked at me before driving off, like a queen watching a peasant refuse to bow, told me this wasn't just about rules. It was about power. And people like her? They didn't like being told no. The first sign that things were getting worse came 3 days later. It was early morning, and I was finishing up feeding my cows when Jasper and Rocky started growling. Not barking, growling, low and deep. Their ears were up, eyes locked on something at the edge of the property. I followed their gaze and spotted a black sedan parked just down the road, just sitting there. No one got out. I watched it for a minute, then took a step forward. Immediately, the car pulled away, driving off at an almost unnatural speed. Weird. At first, I convinced myself it was just a coincidence. Then it happened again. And again. Different cars, different times of day, but always the same pattern. They'd sit there for a while, then leave the second I noticed. They were watching me. A few days later, I drove into town to pick up supplies. Normally, people around here were friendly. It was a small, rural town where folks nodded when they passed each other, where the guy at the feed store always asked how things were going. But this time, something was off. When I walked into the general store, the usual cashier, Nancy, a woman who had always been chatty, barely made eye contact. I noticed a couple of older men at the counter glance at me, whisper something, then look away when I turned. It wasn't obvious hostility, not yet, but there was a shift, a change in the air. I knew exactly what was happening. Sally Flynn was poisoning the well. She was spreading lies about me, probably telling people I was some kind of troublemaker, a bad neighbor, maybe even dangerous. She couldn't beat me with fines, so now she was trying to turn the entire town against me. I clenched my jaw, paid for my supplies, and walked out. I wasn't going to let her win. That weekend, I was out by the barn, fixing a section of fence that had been knocked over during a storm. Jasper and Rocky were roaming nearby, noses to the ground, when suddenly they froze. Then they ran, full speed, barking like hell, straight toward the edge of my property. I followed, heart pounding. When I got there, I saw 2 men in uniforms, not cops, not government, but private security, standing near my barn, holding clipboards. I stepped forward, hands on my hips. "Can I help you?" One of them barely looked up. "Routine property inspection." "For what?" The second guy, shorter and stockier, shifted uncomfortably. "We were told to check for compliance," I scoffed. "By who?" Silence. That's when it hit me. Sally Flynn had sent them. She had hired private security goons to harass me, to check my land, take notes, intimidate me. My blood boiled. I took a step forward. "You have exactly 10 seconds to get off my land before I call the sheriff." The first guy, the smug one, smirked. "We have the right to be here." I stepped closer. "No, you don't." I pulled out my phone and held it up. 9, 8. The shorter guy nudged his partner. "Come on, man, let's go." They hesitated, then turned and walked off. But just before leaving, the smug one looked over his shoulder and grinned. "This isn't over, Whitaker." I clenched my fists as I watched them drive away. They were pushing harder, trying to break me, but I wasn't going anywhere. I thought I had seen the worst. I was wrong. 2 days later, I was inside, finishing up some paperwork, when I heard it. Sirens. I looked out of the window and felt my stomach drop. 3 police cruisers were pulling into my driveway, lights flashing. I stepped outside, heart hammering. Standing next to one of the officers was Sally Flynn, arms crossed, face full of triumph. One of the officers, a younger guy probably new, stepped forward, one hand resting on his holster. "Sir, we've received reports that you've been harassing members of the community, failing to comply with local regulations, and creating a disturbance." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me." Sally cut in, eyes wide with fake concern. "Officer, I have documentation that his property falls under HOA jurisdiction. He refuses to follow the rules, and frankly, his behavior has become a danger to the community." A danger. I had barely spoken to anyone in the last month. I took a step back, trying to think. That's when I noticed the younger officer's hand tighten on his holster, and that's when I realized they weren't just here to talk. They were here to take me in. Panic surged through me. If I got arrested, Sally would win. They'd bury me in fines, legal fees, maybe even push for a forced sale of my land. I couldn't let that happen, so I did the only thing I could think of. I moved slowly, raised my hands, and said, "I have proof." The older officer, the one who seemed less trigger-happy, narrowed his eyes. "What proof?" "My property deed." I turned, walked inside, grabbed a folder full of legal documents, and stepped back out. Carefully, I handed them over. The older officer flipped through them, his brow furrowed. Then his lips pressed into a tight line. He flipped another page, then another. Sally's smug expression started to slip. Finally, the officer looked up. "Well, damn." He turned to Sally. "You want to explain this?" She paled. I smirked. Checkmate. Silence settled over my property, thick and heavy, like the weight of a storm rolling in. The older officer stood there, flipping through my property records, his frown deepening with each page he turned. Sally Flynn, who had spent the last several weeks trying to break me, was finally beginning to realize she had made a mistake. The younger officer, the one who had been ready to cuff me just moments ago, now stood stiffly, his hand loosening from his holster. The older cop sighed, snapping the folder shut. "Your development plans do not override legal property records," he said, voice laced with irritation. He turned to Sally. "This man isn't under your jurisdiction. You know that, don't you?" Sally's lips parted, then closed again. She looked like a fish gasping for air. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, desperately searching for an excuse, an escape. "Well, I assumed his land was included in the expansion." The officer's jaw tightened. "You assumed." I folded my arms, barely able to contain my smirk. "That's funny, Sally, because for the past month, you've been sending me fines like you were absolutely sure." She shot me a sharp glare, but I wasn't done. I turned to the officer, gesturing toward the stack of letters and fines she had sent me. "She's been harassing me nonstop. Fines, threats, fake inspections. Hell, she even had goons trespassing on my land." Sally snapped back to life. "Now wait just a minute. Those were standard compliance checks." "They were illegal." The officer's gaze darkened. "Mrs. Flynn, did you knowingly send security personnel onto private property without the owner's consent?" She hesitated. It was slight, barely a flicker, but it was enough. The officer exhaled sharply. You falsely reported a crime today, Mrs. Flynn. You told us this man was a threat to the community, that he was in violation of local regulations. That was a lie. I watched as the realization finally sank in for her. She had pushed too far, and now she was the one in trouble. She tried to regain control, straightening her blazer. I only did what was in the best interest of the neighborhood. I laughed. Right, because nothing says community spirit like trying to get an innocent man arrested. Her face turned red. The officer shook his head, turning to me. Mr. Whitaker, I apologize for the misunderstanding. I nodded, crossing my arms. You can make it up to me by making sure she never pulls this crap again. The officer's eyes flicked to Sally. We'll be reviewing this incident very carefully, he said, his voice low with warning. I'd advise you to tread carefully from now on, Mrs. Flynn. Filing false police reports is a crime. Trespassing is a crime. If you continue this, there will be legal consequences. Sally clenched her jaw so tightly I thought her teeth might crack. I could see it. This was a woman who was never told no, never put in her place, and certainly never threatened with actual consequences. But for the first time, she had no power, no threats, no fines, nothing. I turned, grabbed the latest violation notice she had sent me, and slowly, deliberately, tore it in half, right in front of her. I told you, Sally. My voice was calm, steady. I don't answer to you, and I never will. Her face twisted in fury, her hands balling into fists at her sides. But she didn't say a word. She couldn't. The fight was over, and she had lost. I thought it was over. I thought Sally Flynn had finally learned her lesson, that after being humiliated in front of the cops, she'd back off, that she'd slink away and lick her wounds, maybe even find some other poor sucker to harass. But people like her, they don't stop. They don't take defeat as a lesson. They take it as a challenge. It started subtly, little things. I woke up one morning to find my mailbox missing. At first, I thought maybe some drunk kids had knocked it over. But no, there weren't any tire tracks, no evidence of it being hit. It was just gone. A few days later, I found a printed HOA violation notice nailed to my barn door. I pulled it down, crumpled it, and threw it away. The next day, another one appeared. This time, I stood outside for nearly an hour, waiting, watching. Nothing. Someone was sneaking onto my land. That's when I knew. They weren't done with me. One evening, I went out to check on my cows and nearly lost my mind. The fence around my pasture, the one I had spent weeks reinforcing, had been cut open. My 3 cows had wandered out into the nearby woods, grazing calmly like they had all the time in the world. Jasper and Rocky had been going crazy inside the house, barking up a storm. And now I knew why. Someone had come onto my property in the middle of the night and deliberately let my animals loose. I grabbed my rifle, slung it over my shoulder, and spent the next hour rounding up my cows. By the time I secured them, I was fuming. This wasn't just about fines or power plays anymore. This was sabotage. This was dangerous. I knew exactly who was behind it, and I knew exactly what I had to do. Sir, the security cameras. The next morning, I drove straight to town and bought a set of high-definition security cameras. Motion activated, night vision, connected directly to my phone. I installed them around the property, one facing the driveway, another watching the barn, and a few covering the pastures. Let them try something now. I didn't have to wait long. Very. Caught in the act. 2 nights later, at exactly 2:37 a.m., my phone buzzed. Motion detected. I sat up, grabbed my phone, and pulled up the live feed. And there, standing in the middle of my driveway, was a man in a black hoodie, holding a stack of HOA violation notices. He was about to nail them to my front door. I zoomed in on his face, one of Sally's little enforcers. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my shotgun, stepped onto the porch, and racked a shell, loud enough for him to hear. His head snapped up. He froze, caught red-handed. I leveled the shotgun, not aiming at him, but close enough to make a point. You've got exactly 5 seconds to get off my land. He didn't wait. He took off running so fast he tripped over his own feet, scrambled back up, and tore down the road like his life depended on it. I watched him go, waited until the dust settled, then calmly walked over, picked up the stack of violation notices he had dropped, and set them on fire. No more games. Sally wanted a war? I was done playing defense. By the time the sun rose, I had already sent the security footage to my lawyer. I had proof, undeniable proof, that the HOA wasn't just harassing me, they were actively trespassing and committing crimes to force me into submission, and I was going to make sure everyone knew it. The legal strike. The next morning, I walked straight into my lawyer's office and laid everything out on the table. The fake fines, the trespassing, the vandalism, the false police report. She didn't even hesitate. We're suing. Within 2 days, she had filed a lawsuit against the Stone Hollow HOA and Sally Flynn personally for harassment, defamation, destruction of property, trespassing, filing a false police report. And the best part? We didn't just go after them, we went after their money. The HOA's insurance company got involved. The second they saw the evidence, they panicked. The HOA board members were terrified. They realized that if this went to court, they weren't just going to lose, they were going to be bankrupt. And Sally Flynn, she finally realized she had picked a fight she couldn't win. The collapse of the HOA. The final HOA meeting was a bloodbath. The moment the lawsuit became public knowledge, the entire neighborhood turned against Sally. The same people who had nodded along at her meetings, the same ones who had blindly followed her ridiculous rules, suddenly wanted nothing to do with her, because now it wasn't about power trips or control, it was about money, and nobody wanted to be on the hook for a 6-figure lawsuit. I didn't attend the meeting, but my lawyer did. And according to her, it took less than 20 minutes for the board to vote Sally Flynn out as HOA president, not just removed from office, banned from ever holding a position in the HOA again. By the end of the week, she had sold her house and left town. By the end of the month, the HOA had completely restructured. They threw out half of their ridiculous rules, fired their legal team, and officially dropped all violations against me. The lawsuit settled out of court. They paid me $50,000 in damages, covered my legal fees, and signed an agreement stating that they would never attempt to enforce HOA rules on my property again. A new era. A few weeks later, a new HOA president knocked on my door. "Before you slam the door in my face," he said, "just hear me out." I leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "You've got 30 seconds. He chuckled. "Fair enough. We're cleaning house, getting rid of the old rules, fixing things, and—" He hesitated. "We want your input." I raised an eyebrow. "You want the guy who fought you to help you?" "Exactly," he said. "You fought back. You won. And we need that kind of perspective if we're going to fix what Sally broke." I considered it. I had spent months hating everything about this HOA, about what it stood for. But now I had a chance to make sure this kind of abuse never happened again. "I'm not joining your board," he laughed. "Didn't expect you to." I sighed. "Fine, I'll give advice. Informally." Trousers, the final victory. A month later, the new HOA hosted a neighborhood barbecue, their way of starting fresh. I almost didn't go. But at the last minute, I changed my mind. I showed up, grabbed a beer, and for the first time since moving here, I actually talked to my neighbors. The same people who had once avoided me out of fear of Sally were now laughing, grilling burgers, drinking, and relaxing. And the irony of it all? After months of fighting the HOA, I had actually helped make it better. I had fought. I had won. And in the end, we all did.